talk to us today about getting the full benefit from your fertilizer dollar. So, John?
Thank you, Ray. Can you guys hear me in the back there? Okay, thank you. Dr. Teutsch double mic'd me, but I've been told it's not because I'm low volume, it's because he has another recording source, so, yeah. So I was asked to talk a little bit about, in terms of alfalfa and frankly in terms of other forages, how we might improve getting some benefits out of lime and fertilizer money. I'm going to talk about a series of topics here, a little bit on soil testing and the soil test report. I'm firmly convinced that not everything that I see in a soil test report has equal value, and I think it's important that you know, at least from my point of view, the things that I find more valuable than others. Second topic is to talk a little bit about how to manage luxury nutrient consumption by alfalfa and forages, and the topic here is especially going to be about potassium. Then I'm going to digress a little bit, talk a little bit about good and bad sources used to reduce soil acidity, with special attention to jug lime and jug calcium chloride. Then we've got some foliar nutrient source challenges out there that I think producers need to be aware of before they spend money. Now, in general, I believe regardless of whether you're starting the year on an established stand or you're starting a new stand, you really need to do a soil test. I'm not going to tell you that a soil test is a perfect animal. It's not. Frankly, every field is somewhat fertility unique because of previous crops, because of past management, use sometimes of animal waste, different kinds of things have gone on there. By the way, the initial timing of the soil test should be driven by your professional expectation of what the soil acidity level is. You're going to have to get rid of the soil acidity. Your target is soil pH 6.8, and the problem is if it's lower than 5.8, you're going to need more time for ag lime to do a good job, and to know how much of that you need, you're going to have to take a soil sample rather earlier than you would if you were just a few months out from seeding that field. So in general, I recommend if you even suspect that that soil pH is 5.8 or below, you want to be out there 6 to 12 months in advance, get your test result back in time to get a good chunk of ag lime on, give it a chance to react before you start the seeding process. If you don't think that's a problem, or you don't mind being surprised, you would not probably be surprised at the number of people who come to an extension office with, oh hell, it's 3 months away from seeding and my pH is 5, okay? But let's try to avoid that if we can. Otherwise, you're going to be 3 to 6 months ahead. And basically, you're going to be looking at, where alfalfa is concerned, you're going to be looking at lime, phosphate, potash, rate recommendations. And these are designed primarily to maximize value to you. They're not going to be overly generous, particularly with potash, because they're going to be worried about things like luxury consumption. But they're going to be there to make sure that site is up to snuff. Now, in general here, we've got relative to, other things here, alfalfa in particular gets a lot of extra attention where potassium is concerned. A fair bit of concern over phosphate, but again, the cutoff there is 60, which is common to all the row crops except tobacco, where recommendations are made up to about 80. But in general, you can see there's a lot of range here, which means the number of fields that we see going into alfalfa that are down in that medium, low medium range is fairly significant, and the table spreads out to provide a lot of detail to the user. That's why those details are there, is because there's a lot of examples of that in the results that we see coming out of the lab. Moving on to soil testing for established stands, I strongly believe that alfalfa is one of the more valuable crops we grow in this state on a per acre basis. And for me, and because of the value of fertility, and because potash isn't 125 bucks a ton anymore, and trust me, it's never going back, I think it ought to be soil sampled every year. I like to see a fall soil test taken just after the next to the last cutting, particularly in 4 and 5 cut systems. And I like to guide those lime P and K applications just ahead of that last cutting, and particularly be ready to add some lime if that soil pH is less than 6.4. We want to keep it above 6.4 up to 6.8. This will really work in your benefit to help get through that last cutting or a frost cutting and get into optimizing those stands' survival through the winter. And again, the rate recs are designed to maximize value. Things do change, however. We're going to, for the same soil test phosphorus level, we got a lot less detail here. In theory, we're working in a narrower range. We do see a few fields get down in here, but you'll notice we don't have that depth of detail in phosphate, but we still have the same depth of detail in potash, and we have the same numbers. Alfalfa is a heavy user of potassium. We're going to talk a little bit about how to make sure you get value for that use, but the bottom line is potassium is one where we really have a lot of detail, and phosphate, it drops off, where we're looking at initial soil test versus established stand soil test. You're going to get some soil test reports. If you do what a number of producers do, and I don't have any problem with this, you're going to potentially send same sample, or you're going to send samples off, split them up. Maybe your fertilizer dealer offers a free soil test. The extension office in your county maybe makes you pay for a soil test. And you say, well, I want to do some checking. You can get exactly, and if the labs are part of a national certification lab, which most commercial and public labs are, you're going to get the same soil test result, particularly on a well split up sample. But you're not going to get the same rate recs. The rate recommendations are likely to be different for a number of reasons. A lot of that involves these 3 different philosophies behind the rate recommendation. You can have something from a lab that believes in buildup and maintenance. Generally, they're fertilizing the soil, not so much for the crop, but for the soil. And they want to maintain it. I've seen rate recommendations for a Morey silt loam that tested over 400 pounds of phosphate per acre. And they just wanted to keep applying phosphate. That's not good value to you. That's throwing good money after bad. We've got another group out there that believe in a philosophy called nutrient balance. They want to balance the nutrients in the soil when in reality plants have evolved over thousands of years to take what they need from the soil, as long as the soil has enough of it, and leave what they don't need behind. Yes, there are situations where you can drive a plant towards toxicity, but in general, plants are well evolved over a fairly wide range of tissue concentrations to maximize yield. But they still like to have these cation saturation ratios or other ratios, micronutrient ratios, and they fertilize the soil. Most of the public labs, most university labs, have some combination of what's called sufficiency level plus maybe a buildup for those really low soil testing fields like you might have when you're starting out an alfalfa crop. In those situations, the university recommendations are going to have a buildup component because it can't just have you adding fertilizer and keeping a low overall soil test, particularly with potassium where alfalfa is concerned. This is an example of what I call maintenance regardless the soil test value. In this particular scenario, we have, admittedly, by this lab's number, they have high phosphate, almost 200 pounds, and high potash, 350 pounds roughly. But yet, we also have additional phosphate and potash recommendations. In alfalfa, that's not such a bad idea on the potash side because you want to maintain somewhere between, say, 300 and 450 on the soil test. But for a crop like corn, for example, some of you probably do grow a bit of corn, that's patently ridiculous. Take advantage of the soil test level you've got, save the fertilizer of $1 for the next year's crop. Remember, putting fertilizer on a soil when you don't need it is not putting money in a soil bank account. It's putting fertilizer in the soil. And that doesn't pay interest. In fact, because of things like fixation and erosion and losses, it pays negative interest. You will have less nutrient there for the next crop than you have right now. and it will not have done the current crop any good at all either. The chemical and the biological uncertainty that those nutrients face makes a soil fertilizer bank significantly less valuable than leaving the dollars in the bank. And I know banks don't pay a hell of a lot of interest these days either, okay? But trust me, it beats negative interest. The literature is full of examples where small annual doses of fertilizer are more efficient than large maintenance applications applied less often. You just lose too much when you use large doses if you can avoid them and have smaller maintenance doses. Inflation itself will cause the present value of residual soil fertility to be lower than it was when it was applied. These recommendations, I apologize for the tiny font, are based on a lab that uses what's called nutrient balance or basic cation saturation ratio. So for example, they got a recommendation in here for sulfomag, sulfate of potash, magnesia, some zinc when the soil test zinc is pretty good and all that. I detail that on this next slide. So this particular lab on this sample found a pH of 6.5. Soil test calcium, magnesium, and potassium are 3326, 226, and 315 pounds per acre respectively. All pretty darn good. And yet they recommended, in order to balance the cations, 500 pounds, quarter ton of K-mag. They said the reason to balance it wasn't because of the magnesium, it was because of the potassium. Why not use potassium chloride? It wasn't a tobacco crop. Potassium chloride, 230 pounds of that would have provided the same potassium as the K-mag. They recommended, despite a soil test sulfur level of 24 pounds an acre, they recommended 50 pounds of elemental sulfur, the least available source of sulfur on the market. It has to be biologically oxidized by thiobacillus before it will become available. And what about the sulfur in the bloody sulfomag? Sulfomag has 22% sulfur by weight. I could have easily gotten all the sulfur I needed from it, but no, still had to have a separate recommendation. Soil test phosphorus was 115 pounds, and for this particular crop, the cutoff was 120 pounds, so they didn't need very much, but they still recommended 250 pounds of DAP per acre. To balance out was something else, I guess. Soil test boron was 2. That's plenty good. Zinc was 13. That's above good. Still recommended 15 pounds, 10 pounds, 15 pounds of borate and 10 pounds of zinc sulfate. I tally these suckers up. You get 150 pounds for the sulfomag, 15 pounds for the elemental sulfur, 50 pounds for the DAP, and 25 pounds for the borate plus sulfate. That's $240 an acre at those prices. If you do a strike-off, you've just saved $240 an acre, and I would do a complete strike-off. I wouldn't put a penny's worth of this stuff on. But that's where some of these philosophies can get you. Here's one from UK. In deference, I never leave a grower. I'm proud of the fact that UK did this test, but I would never leave a grower's name on a report, so that's why that's struck off there. In this particular example, phosphate was rated very high, 103 pounds for this particular crop, which I believe was corn or soybean. UK recommends none. The difference in a lab like ours and a difference in some of the public labs is that when you reach that very high level, we don't keep on adding fertilizer. We say, okay, you've maintained a high soil test level, let's take advantage of that for a year, and then you can retest again in a year or two and see where you're at. Efficiency level philosophy is based on the law of diminishing returns. No fertilizer recommendation is made at the high or very high test levels. But to do this well, you have to have a full set of what's correlation data, what's the relationship of yield to soil test, and calibration data, which says for each different kind of soil I have in the region, what's the level of potash I need for that soil when the soil test K is, say, only 150 and I need it to be 300, because it's not the same from soil to soil usually. You need to adjust then for suboptimal nutrient levels for a given crop. And each crop has to be separately calibrated, separately correlated too. The strengths of this approach is that the law of diminishing returns is well recognized in biological response information. It's well validated. And the other thing that makes it work is the yearly economics. It works year over year. It's one of the reasons why when I give a talk like this, I talk about it as part of the presentation. This is an example for alfalfa. Malic 3 is the soil test extractant that like 85% of labs in our region are using, public and private. Basically what this shows is that at a soil test level of about 280, these samples are taken in the fall ahead of the last cutting, but before the fertilizer application that would come right after that. It shows that you're pretty close to optimum at about 300 pounds. 280 is the cut point there. But it shows something really important. If you get below that, the amount you're going to lose by having too little is going to be a lot more important than the amount you were going to lose by having too much. So you can be a little over, and you'll be fine where alfalfa is concerned. But if you get too much under, you're going to have problems. It could be low overwintering stand. You lose stands. It could be low yields in the next first cutting. Depends a little bit on the situation. But the bottom line is all this work was accumulated by Bill Thom on alfalfa when he was working here in Kentucky over the years. So that's why there's a lot of data points. It's not a perfect relationship. You got some points above the line. The 100% was created by the highest mean treatment. So you got some individual plots and areas that got above it. And you got some that even though we're out here at 600 pounds, they're down there around 90%. They didn't give the highest yield. Probably something else is going on. An insect problem, disease problem. They didn't give the optimum yield. But the overall trend is illustrated there. This has a red highlighted title because it's meant to be a red flag. Other things to think about when you read your soil test report. If you see a soil test value for copper, manganese, and iron on a soil test report for a Kentucky soil, it means absolutely nothing. There is no soil test correlated for those three elements for this state. We've not had deficiencies to any great extent so we could actually go out and correlate a soil test to a yield and calibrate it with a fertilizer addition, foliar or otherwise. There's no field deficiency large enough in the area for us to work with. Soil test value for sulfur. I love this one. How many people in this room have applied sulfur within the past 2 years? You guys are really behind the times. Your grain colleagues are out there 95 to 1. They've all been scared. The sky isn't falling enough sulfur anymore. You used to say the sky was falling. Well, trust me, everybody was saying, well, we're not getting any more from atmospheric deposition. The last coal-fired unit at Paradise power plant was just shut off. It was legally emitting 10,000 tons of SO2 per year, most of which went downwind. So I guess if you're a grain guy or an alfalfa guy on the other side of Paradise, west of it, well, then maybe you had a reason to keep applying or start applying. But there wasn't much reason to be applying sulfur east of it. Didn't matter. They all did anyway. There again, there's no valid soil test procedure for sulfur in Kentucky soils. What's worse, based on work done in other states, if there was one, you couldn't get a valid number with a 0 to 4 or 0 to 6 sample. If it was high enough, it would mean you didn't need it. But if it was low, you wouldn't know because in reality, sulfate moves into the subsoil. that's where the sample would have to come. We all know how well people love to take deeper soil samples, getting into those clay subsoils. The boron value in Kentucky has some value if it's done by hot water extraction, which is what Frank Sikora's lab does. It doesn't have any value if it's Mehlich 3, which is what a number of other labs use. How many of you have used the cation exchange capacity value that you see on soil test reports? What did you use it for, if you don't mind telling me? Okay. There are some states, the tri-states, Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, have a set of recommendations where the CEC plays a role in how they define the optimum level of potash. So that is a legitimate use. If you have a really high CEC soil, you move up to Eden Hill country, they have high CECs, they have a lot of illitic clay. At least in the old days, Ken Wells used to train county agents that 300 pounds of K wasn't enough. You had to have more K, particularly for tobacco when it was being grown up there, but I think a lot of that's moved out. But a lot of the CECs that come out of the lab are not measured. They're calculated. There was a recent presentation at a meeting I was at which shows the calculated CECs significantly underestimate the actual CEC on acid soils and significantly overestimate it on high pH soils. So you need to learn to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. That CEC number may be useful for guiding something like potash, but it's not as valuable as if the lab measures it. So you might ask the lab what they're doing. Now, I work with loan officers at banks, particularly in Northwest Ohio, which is pretty close to my home in southern Michigan. And one of the things that happens when economic crunch time hits, the loan officer gives me these fertility prescriptions that their clients are bringing to them and asking for an operating loan in support of. Basically, if you see these kind of things in a fertilizer prescription, you need to think about a strike-off. There's no real good reason to put on pelletized lime at these rates, unless you're in an emergency situation on a high-value crop. Then maybe you'll get enough bang for the buck. They are truly carbonate products, and they are truly finely divided, but they still will take a couple months to work. There's no need for gypsum for calcium when the soil pH is greater than about 5. I've never seen a response to a liquid humic acid or humate product ever, and I've tested it on several crops over 8 to 6 locations each year in this state. Chemical fertilizer additives, for some of the nitrogen products they work, but those are irrelevant to alfalfa. We don't apply much nitrogen to alfalfa except as part of DAP or MAP. Biological fertilizer additives. I'm not against biology. There will be changes in the way we farm based on biology. No question about it. It's coming. There's a lot of money being spent, and I think there'll be good products. But don't tell me, the first one I got was, well, you can take a jug of this stuff and you just pour it in a liquid UAN tank. Well, you know what? We salt cure hams for a reason. It kills everything. And there aren't many bugs that are going to stand up to 28% liquid nitrogen. And sure enough, they didn't. The Indiana State chemists tested a bunch of those products, and most of them, the bugs died in storage, let alone died when they got added to fertilizer. All right? So just be cautious. Some things may work as seed treatments. I'm not, just like rhizobium works, some of these things are working, some of these bugs working as seed treatments, that's fine. But pouring them on top of dry fertilizer or liquid fertilizer, For those nutrient elements where you're unsure of the value of a soil test, think about using plant tissue analysis. We can see in this growth, this is a typical growth curve, growth as a percent of the maximum as a function of the concentration of nutrient in the tissue on a dry basis. you can see that you get rapid increases in growth here for the first increments in removing deficiency. Then there's a 10% region near the top called the region of hidden hunger. Then you have that region of luxury consumption, and then for some nutrients you actually move over into toxicity if you hammer them too hard. Boron, copper, zinc, manganese are all in that category. You can drive a plant into toxicity with too much. Plant tissue analysis is a very nice tool to check what your plant thinks about what you're doing, and it helps you anticipate some of next year's challenges. These are some tissue analysis guidelines that come from the literature for alfalfa. They give an indication of what's low, what's kind of in a sufficiency range, and then what's high. Not necessarily toxic, but they're on the high side, and you certainly don't want to be worried about a nutrient that's in the high side. You want to focus on things that are low or lowish as you move forward. To do this, you take the upper 6 inches of a whole plant at first flower. And again, I'm recommending you use this to check the status of nutrients that are not well understood by virtue of a soil test report.
If somebody wants to check on sulfur, then it would be a tissue test, would be the test?
Yes, although I will tell you, I've been working with a group of people on sulfur across several crops in actually multiple countries. And sulfur has resisted, we've looked at 4 or 5 different soil tests. We found nothing that we like. There are some things that work a little better in one region or another. And we've been looking at tissue testing. The biggest bugaboo about tissue testing is people think that something like a nitrogen-sulfur ratio is better than sulfur in the tissue itself. Remember, a tissue concentration is just a ratio of the nutrient upon dry matter. When you take nitrogen over sulfur, all you've done is factored out dry matter. Now, if you have a high nitrogen-sulfur ratio, is nitrogen in excess or is sulfur deficient? You can convince yourself you don't really know. That's not true. Most of the time, the way these ratios go, they come up like this, they have a big flat area, and they go down like that. On this end, that nutrient's deficient, and on the other end, it's the other nutrient's deficient. And in the middle, it doesn't matter. And those are broad, flat tops. There's a wide range in these ratios for which, if you're trying to push it around within that, it's a fool's errand. Don't worry about it. It varies with the crop, but remember, because it's on a big, broad plateau, I could give you a centroid, but I don't want you to push for that if you're already, even if you're on the edge over here. You only want to be up off the area where either nitrogen is deficient over here or sulfur is deficient over here. Not for grasses and legumes. It would be different. For grasses like wheat, corn, fescue, things like that, it's a little bit on the lower side, say somewhere around 20. On the legume side, it's going to be a little higher, probably close to 25, before it becomes a big problem due to sulfur deficiency. No, it's 25 N upon S, that's correct. In some situations, you can go as low as 10, though, and not actually be falling off the edge. That's why I get real tense about giving one number. Okay? I get real tense about that. Yeah. And my perspective is on most forages, put on your nitrogen and don't worry a damn thing about your sulfur. Mm-hmm. And those fields clearly were deficient in sulfur, and you could have diagnosed that just with tissue sulfur, and you would not have needed an NS ratio. Their sulfur would have been down in the low range, let's say for alfalfa, been down below, say about 0.15. That's where we start to see responses. But we haven't seen, Edwin Ritchie did a big survey of alfalfa in Kentucky along with Ray, and there were very few samples that even tested below 0.25. So for the most part, a lot of that sulfur that had been spent was, again, not a wise investment of that fertilizer dollar. But I'm not going to say you're not going to have situations where you won't get a response. There will be situations where you will get a response. We're starting to see them. Most of them are west, further west, not east. Moving on to luxury consumption, one of the big problems with potash. But all crops give evidence of this phenomenon. The reason the grain guys get away with it is the grain takes over and it leaves what the plant doesn't put in the grain, it leaves it behind in the stover and it gets returned to the field. That doesn't happen with alfalfa. Grass is grown for forage. It's essentially more problematic and more consequential with alfalfa and potassium. Alfalfa uptake and excessive need for dry matter production is what I'm talking about here. In other words, we're on that part of that response curve where you're increasing the tissue K concentration, but the dry matter accumulation is flat. So I give you here an example. We've got an alfalfa dry matter potassium concentration of, say, 2.67%. That equals about 53 pounds of K per ton of dry matter, which is 64 pounds of K2O per ton of dry matter, which is 55 pounds of K2O per ton of hay, assuming 14.5% moisture. That's what's in AGR 210, I think it is, okay? And that's approximately 100 pounds of 0060. Luxury removal, not a typical example here, is 90 pounds of K2O per ton of hay, which is about 4.37% K on a dry matter basis. That's a lot of potassium you ship out the door that nobody pays you for. So where you are up here, you're up here in this flat area, right up in here, and you're not over in this region, you're up in this region where you don't want to be in terms of losing money on every ton of alfalfa hay sold. You get nutrient uptake with no dry matter or yield increase. How do we manage this? Again, my reminder, potash prices are moving around somewhere between $300 and $500 a ton, depending on who you buy and where you buy it and when you buy. We're never going back to the good old days. There was probably 3 decades where potash didn't move much above 125 and got down as low as 85 bucks a ton. We're not going back. The people in Canada have learned that having all that storage filled up with potash that nobody really wanted and they were paying for storing it isn't happening. They've become much more what we call just-in-time producers. They fill up rail cars from the mining process just as they're basically ready to go out the door. And by having that drag on it, that keeps prices up. And that's what they're doing. Most of the fertilizer K that you might try to raise soil test K with can be immediately removed in the first harvest after application if you time it badly. It'll just get sucked up and it's gone. So don't try to push, try to maintain soil test K between 300 and 450 pounds of K per acre. That's 150 to 225 parts per million K if you are using a lab that reports in ppm. Avoid adding K between the last harvest of, say, year 1 and the first harvest of year 2 if your soil test K is above 300. You're going to get some weathering of minerals during the winter time. It's going to release some potassium in most soils, particularly most of where we grow alfalfa, Griders, Baxters, things like that. You're going to get some K release, and that's going to go and be used in the first harvest, the big harvest in the first spring. Okay? You might also, Josh might talk more about this than I, but you might think about grid sampling fields to understand if you've got some variability in some of your alfalfa fields. I don't know that you do. I haven't sampled forage fields here. I have sampled them in West Virginia, and they had quite a bit of field variability. If we look at potash not applied to grids with higher than average and extra K applied to grids with lower than average and average across the whole field, and in '95 when I did this work, we valued it at 150 bucks a ton. That was when it was really cheap. And even then, redistributed K, particularly when we got real close in here to the 300 field average K, redistributed K was worth about $7 an acre. But the economics have changed. Not so much for the grid sampling, but for the potash. Gee, 3 times. So it's probably up around $21 to $28 an acre to redistribute K in a field according to what a grid sample says, assuming you can get it a reasonably good sample. Just a thought. So the overwinter release of potash is from the soil is usually substantial enough to support the first cutting as long as your soil test is already at that 280, 300 region. If it falls below 250, split potassium applications are strongly recommended in a 4 to 5 cut per year system. Many alfalfa producers are already applying the K just after both the first and the third cuttings. That tends to reduce luxury consumption in the first cutting, enhances later cut yields, and enhances overwintering of the stand. Fields, though, with different soils behave really interestingly. This is data that Ken Wells had. This is the initial soil test, 188, so it was not high. He had 3 treatments applied, and he applied them in 100 and 200 for each of 3 years. So there's really 3 applications here. And at the end of the 3 years, here's what he had. It only went down 10 pounds of K per acre. Okay, that's the change there. It only went up 12 here with this, and it only went up 164 here. And the interesting thing is, he measured the K removal. He took some really good yields and some really high K removals here. This is all the potassium that he got from somewhere else in that soil. Now here I've called it mineral K released. And in some soils, that's exactly what happened. Some of the soil minerals broke apart and released potassium. But there's a monolith out there that has an alfalfa root system, courtesy of Gabe. What's a typical rooting depth for alfalfa? Not in our soils. Not 20 or 30 feet in our.
I've got a root at home that's 10 feet long.
That's true. In some soils, it can be that. But 4 is more typical. On the other hand, where do you take a soil test from? 6 inches. So anybody want to give a guess if some of this, if some of this found potassium didn't come from much deeper in the profile? That's probably where a lot of it came from. Although in some soils, it may have come also a chunk from the minerals. It's really interesting when you look at situations. I put that Pembroke alfalfa data, that's what's over there on your left, okay, right here. Here's the applied minus removed in pounds of K per acre. In every case, we're in the negative. We didn't apply enough to even make up for removal. And even then, the soil test level in the surface increased. I think it got a lot of that alfalfa deeper down. We look at a corn-soybean system that was studied by myself and Bill Thom. We're a lot closer to the centroid, but still, here's our check. It went down over 5 years. Here's where we applied some, but clearly not enough in terms of soil test. Here's where we got closer. And we got the soil test to jump up, even though we're now close to 0 for this. And then we went way up when we got applied minus remove, well above. And then here's the soil. This soil had corn, wheat, and red clover. And it hardly budges at all either way. So what I'm about to say to that means you have to keep your soil test results, try to send them to the same lab, try to get them at the same time, the sample I mean. Josh is going to say something similar, maybe not to you all, but probably will, and I believe what he says. You need to keep records so that you understand as you apply fertilizer and as you estimate what you're removing, you understand whether you've got one of these really ugly buffered systems that doesn't budge much in terms of the soil test, or you have one that's more dynamic, like that one in the middle there, where it really shifts. And that'll change from field to field and soil to soil. As you get familiar with that, you'll get more comfortable with how much fertilizer K you're going to apply. So we have these three different systems. The Pembroke exhibits a greater removal than reflected in the soil test. The Belknap exhibits greater change, less buffering, and the Nason exhibits a high buffering. And hence, soil K management can be very different, very field unique, very individualized. Moving on to managing soil acidity and meeting the need for calcium and magnesium. Alfalfa removes about 30 pounds of calcium and 6 pounds of magnesium per ton of dry matter. That's equivalent to about 100 pounds of dolomitic lime. Each calcium and each magnesium causes 2 hydrogens to be released into the soil, and over time that acidity has to be neutralized. If you don't neutralize it, the acidity builds up, the stand is diminished. Acid is neutralized by a base. The bases listed here are oxides, bicarbonates, hydroxides, and carbonates. Acid is not neutralized by a salt. You don't neutralize acid with chlorides, nitrates, or sulfates. Those are salts. Doesn't work. If we look at calcium carbonate, the first thing that happens is it has to dissolve. This is what makes calcium carbonate a slow reacting base. It doesn't have a high solubility product. It doesn't dissolve quickly unless it's really ground up fine to increase the amount of specific surface that it has. The second step is the acid is neutralized by the carbonate, and it's merely replaced by the calcium. Calcium does not neutralize hydrogen. It just replaces it. The carbonate is what neutralizes it. In this case, it forms water and CO2. First forms carbonic acid, and those break apart. And the ugly thing is, and I'm sorry to say this, that 50 pounds of calcium carbonate is required to neutralize a mere 1 pound of hydrogen. That is why lime recommendations start in the hundreds of pounds and move into the tons, because of that ratio of 50 to 1. You take up 40 pounds of calcium into a ton of hay, you're only releasing 2 pounds of hydrogen from the plant, but it takes 100 pounds of calcium carbonate to neutralize that. Now let's look at one of the fine calcium products on the market, calcium chloride. It has to dissolve in the soil water, and yes, it dissolves quickly. It is very soluble. It's a soluble salt, calcium chloride. Then to be analogous, it would have to be neutralized by the 2 chlorides and simultaneously replaced. Well, I can get it to do that, but to do this, I have to form hydrochloric acid. How stable is hydrochloric acid going to be? It'll burn the crap out of you. So the bottom line is it's not stable. Therefore, that reaction doesn't go in that direction. That's why I put a big old X right there. It goes in the reverse direction. You add hydrochloric acid to a soil, you're going to get hydrogen and then calcium chloride, because calcium is the dominant cation in the soil. This reaction can't go. It wouldn't go if it was nitrate. It wouldn't go if it was sulfate, because those are also strong acids that we'd be trying to form. So when you see a label that says, I blanked out the manufacturer for this one, if it says, like it says in the red circle, derived from calcium chloride, this is not a liming agent. It is a calcium agent, yes, no problem. And if you're going to buy it, don't pay 30 bucks a jug. Buy it for what the road department buys it for. That's what they spray. That's the liquid stuff they put on the first deployed salt, anticipating. That's calcium chloride, same stuff. Or go drain a tractor tire. Although lately they've been switching to calcium acetate, but again, it'd still be better than that. The other product that I saw, commonly available, is really finely divided, finely ground calcium carbonate or magnesium carbonate, calcium carbonate dolomite. It still needs 50 pounds, though, of effective calcium carbonate to take care of 1 pound of hydrogen. So let's say I buy a liquid suspension product that weighs about 14.8 pounds per gallon, and it has a calcium carbonate equivalence of only 65% because it's 30% water by weight. It has an R&D of 65% because all the solids are very finely divided. They'll pass a 200 mesh screen, some won't pass 300 mesh screen. I mean, they'll go. But let's say we pay 10 bucks a gallon, and by the way, that's the bulk rate. That's the bulk rate. If you buy it in a 2.5 gallon jug, it's going to cost you closer to 20 bucks a gallon. So we pay 10 bucks. We have a 0.65, because I take 65% divided by 100 times 14.8 pounds, and I get $1.04 per unit of relative neutralizing value. Okay? Now, what if I take a miserable looking lime? This is a pretty mediocre lime with an R&V of 50%. And I buy a ton of it for 30 bucks. And then for that, I can get it delivered and spread, at least in Caldwell County. Okay? So I pay 30 bucks, multiply by 0.5 times, divide by the combination of 0.5 times 2,000. I paid 3 cents, 3 cents per pound of R&V. All right? Again, getting value for the buck. I'm not going to tell you the suspension product won't control acidity. It will. And it'll be a tad faster, but you won't see it because if you don't put on a super high rate, it won't matter. It still has a limited capacity based on pounds of how much acid it's going to neutralize. Foliar products. Oh, I love these things. I'm on my last lap. There's a lot of them. Labels galore. You have to calculate the benefit of these things. You have to understand something about what you need. The first thing you should ask after the label is if you don't find all the analysis information on the label, ask for either the master safety data sheet or the safety data sheet. It's called an MSDS or simply an SDS. Here's one. This one has a lot of things in it, but the only thing that's really guaranteed is on the 11.8.5 line. So we're going to use a jug to put on a macronutrient mix. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. Now, in this particular example, I admit I stole it from a corn soybean crowd. Okay? So this is the analysis, and this is on a weight basis in the jug. The jug weighs 10 pounds per gallon, and they're recommending you put on 1 to 2 quarts per acre. I'm going to be generous. I'm going to put on 2 quarts an acre. All right? But here's what I'm putting on. Up at the top, this is what a corn crop needs, okay, for a mere 150 bushels. Here's what's going to be provided by an application rate of 2 quarts. 0.55 pounds of N, 0.25 pounds of P, 0.4 pounds of K, blah, blah, blah. If I put on 10 gallons, trust me, you don't want to pay for that. Okay? This is what I'm going to get. So you compare the benefit to the need. 20 applications gets me 10 gallons, gets me about 5% on average of what that corn crop needs. And that includes some of the micros. There are some foliar products that are very good products for the micronutrients. Boron, zinc, copper if you need it. Not here, but in states where they do. They make very good foliar products for the micro elements. Macro elements, you couldn't put on enough concentrate on without burning the heck out of the plant tissue. Whoops. Generally, the only region where if you have a suspicion from tissue analysis you're in a problem, you get a 10% reduction in growth. We're adding 10% roughly increase in concentration. I have a 10% rule. The product needs to effectively deliver, cost effectively deliver, at least 10% of the crop's nutrient uptake requirement. If it doesn't do that, I don't think it's worth the fertilizer dollar that we're talking about. So in summary, I do think that nutrient and pH management for alfalfa are especially critical. It's a high-value crop in most growers' minds, and I do believe it could be informed by regular soil testing, more often than even every other year. I think potassium consumption can be managed and luxury consumption avoided, and I believe that both lime and foliar products that cost effectively deliver soil acidity and nutrients can be found, but you have to be very peculiar and particular about that. Some product claims, and I'm not kidding you when I say this, they're not just simply untrue. They're damn lies. That's one of the reasons why I wasn't sure I wanted this talk recorded, Deutsch. They're just plain damn lies. So purchase of those is a waste of money, and then the time to apply them is compounding that. Thank you very much, and I may have time for a question or two.